Chapter 1. Another day, another mess. Eric sighed as he adjusted the strap of his school bag and stepped out of his house. The morning air was crisp, but it did nothing to clear the frustration clouding his mind. He already knew how today would go. Jack, that guy had made it his life's mission to annoy him every single day. It wasn't exactly bullying. Jack never said anything outright cruel, never hurt him. But he had an uncanny ability to make Eric's life just a little more difficult than it needed to be. Eric walked down the familiar route to school, his thoughts replaying all the times Jack had made him want to scream. Last week, Jack had accidentally spilled his drink all over Eric's notebook in the cafeteria. "Oops," he'd said, grinning as he handed over a bunch of crumpled napkins. "Guess you'll have to rewrite all your notes? Should I help?" Help? As if. And just yesterday, Jack had taken the seat beside him in class and spent the entire period poking at his arm with the end of a pen. "You looked sleepy," he'd said when Eric had finally snapped. "I was just keeping you awake." Eric gritted his teeth. Why him? Why did Jack always have to single him out? The worst part was that Jack wasn't like this with anyone else. With their classmates, he was normal, friendly. But with Eric? It was like he turned into a different person. A person whose only goal was to drive him insane. Eric rounded the corner, spotting the school gates up ahead. Just as he did, he caught sight of Jack leaning casually against the wall, chatting with some friends. The moment their eyes met, Jack smirked. Great. Here we go again. Chapter 2. Unavoidable Encounters. Eric considered turning around and walking in the opposite direction. Maybe skipping school just this once wouldn't be so bad. But before he could even take a step back, Jack pushed off the wall and strolled toward him with that same infuriating smirk. "Morning sunshine," Jack drawled, falling into step beside him. Eric ignored him. Maybe if he didn't react, Jack would lose interest. No such luck. Jack leaned in slightly, his voice teasing. "You're awfully quiet today. What, did you actually get a full night's sleep for once?" Eric rolled his eyes. "Unlike you, I have things to do other than bother people." Jack clutched his chest in mock hurt. "Ouch! And here I thought we had something special." "We don't." Jack just chuckled, like he found Eric's irritation amusing. He reached out and ruffled Eric's hair, making him swat his hand away. "Seriously, stop doing that," Eric snapped. "You're worse than a stray cat." "Stray cat, huh?" Jack grinned. "So does that make you the grumpy old man who feeds me out of pity?" Eric groaned and walked faster, but Jack easily kept pace. They reached the classroom, and Eric hurried to his seat, hoping Jack would finally leave him alone. But of course, that wasn't going to happen. "Guess what?" Jack said, sliding into the seat right behind him. Eric didn't respond, choosing to take out his books instead. Jack leaned forward, resting his chin on his arms. The teacher rearranged the seating chart. Eric froze, dread creeping up his spine. "No." "Oh yes," Jack said, sounding far too pleased. "Looks like we're going to be seatmates for a while." Eric dropped his head onto his desk with a groan. This was going to be a long semester. Eric lifted his head just enough to glare at Jack. "You're lying." Jack grinned and waved a folded paper in front of him. "The seating chart. See for yourself." Eric snatched it and quickly scanned the list. His stomach sank. Right there, next to his name, was Jack's. "This has to be some kind of mistake," Eric muttered, gripping the paper like it had personally betrayed him. "Nope, it's fate," Jack said, sounding way too smug. "Guess you're stuck with me." Eric resisted the urge to crumple the list into a ball. Instead, he took a deep breath and reminded himself that he was a mature, reasonable person. He could survive this. The classroom slowly filled with students, and soon their teacher walked in, confirming the seating changes. Eric begrudgingly moved to his new spot while Jack plopped down beside him, looking far too comfortable. As the lesson began, Eric focused on taking notes, trying to pretend Jack didn't exist, but that proved impossible when Jack kept tapping his pencil against the desk in an irritating rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Eric clenched his jaw. Tap, tap. He shot Jack a sharp look. "Could you not?" Jack raised an eyebrow. "Not what?" "That," Eric hissed, pointing at the pencil. Jack smirked but stopped. All right, I'll behave." For a few blessed minutes there was silence. Then out of nowhere, a small folded note landed on Eric's desk. He glanced at Jack, who was pretending to be engrossed in his book, but the grin tugging at his lips gave him away. Sighing, Eric unfolded the paper. Did you always look this cute when you're mad? Or is it just me? Heat rushed to Eric's face. His fingers clenched around the note before he quickly shoved it into his notebook. He refused to give Jack the satisfaction of a reaction. Jack, however, chuckled under his breath. You're blushing, aren't you? He whispered. Eric bit his lip, determined not to let Jack get to him. But as much as he hated to admit it, Jack's words lingered longer than they should have. Chapter 3. Unsettling Changes. Eric had expected his first day sitting next to Jack to be annoying. What he hadn't expected was whatever this was. It started during lunch. Eric had barely opened his bento when Jack plopped down across from him, setting his own tray on the table. You eat so little, Jack commented, eyeing Eric's neatly packed meal. What are you, a bird? Eric frowned. It's normal, Jack hummed in disagreement. Then, before Eric could react, he took one of his fries and dropped it into Eric's bento. There. Eat more. Eric blinked. What? Consider it a gift, Jack said, winking. From me to my favorite classmate. Eric stared at the fry like it was some foreign object. Normally, he would have thrown it back at Jack or snapped at him for messing with his food, but instead an unfamiliar warmth settled in his chest. What is wrong with me? Shaking it off, he pushed the fry to the side and focused on eating, but the feeling lingered. Then, later that day, it happened again. They were in the hallway, walking to their next class, when Eric tripped slightly over the uneven floor. It wasn't a big deal. He barely stumbled, but before he could steady himself, a hand grabbed his wrist. Jack. Whoa, careful, Jack said, his grip firm but casual. If you fall, I'll have to carry you, and we both know you'd die of embarrassment. Eric pulled his arm away, his heartbeat unreasonably fast. I wasn't going to fall. Jack smirked. Sure. Eric wanted to argue, but his brain was too busy replaying the sensation of Jack's hand on his wrist. It had been warm. Steady. Nope. Absolutely not. Yet, even as he sat in class later, his hand still tingled where Jack had touched him. And much to his dissatisfaction, he found himself sneaking glances at Jack when he thought no one was looking. For the first time, Jack's teasing didn't feel just annoying. It felt different. And that terrified him. Eric tapped his pen against his notebook, pretending to focus on the lesson. But his mind was far from the words on the page. Instead, it kept drifting back to Jack. His dumb smirk, his casual touches, the way his presence had started feeling less bothersome and more something else. And that something else was the real problem. He stole a glance at Jack, who was lazily spinning his pen between his fingers, completely unfazed. As if nothing had changed. Because nothing has changed, Eric reminded himself. Jack is just being Jack. But if that was true, why did it feel different now? A soft sigh escaped him as he dropped his gaze back to his notes. Maybe he was overthinking it. Maybe he was just tired. That had to be it. Yet, the universe seemed determined to prove him wrong. When the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Eric stood up too quickly, his knee hitting the edge of the desk. He barely managed to stifle a pained hiss as he stumbled back into his chair. Jack, who had been halfway out of his seat, paused. Smooth, he commented, amusement in his voice. But instead of walking off like usual, he crouched beside Eric's chair. Did you just take yourself out with a desk? Impressive. Eric shot him a glare. I'm fine. Jack ignored that, and before Eric could protest, reached out and lightly touched his knee. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a quick, assessing press against the spot where he'd bumped it. But Eric's breath caught anyway. You're not dying, Jack said after a moment, his tone light, but his eyes flickered with something else. You'll live. Eric swallowed, heart stuttering. Obviously. Jack stood up, grinning. Still, maybe you should lean on me for the rest of the day. You know, in case desks start attacking again. Eric rolled his eyes, but the warmth from Jack's touch lingered. It was ridiculous. It shouldn't mean anything, but his body was betraying him. His heartbeat too quick, his face too warm, his thoughts too jumbled. And then Jack, as if sensing his turmoil, leaned in just slightly and murmured, "Or you could let me carry you. I did offer earlier." Eric shoved him back before he could process how flustered he was. Get lost, Jack. Jack just laughed, hands raised in surrender. Fine, but don't miss me too much. Eric groaned and turned away, but even as he left the classroom, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. And worse, he wasn't sure he hated it. Chapter 4. A Line Crossed. Eric had spent the past few days trying to ignore the strange shift in his feelings, convincing himself that Jack was just being Jack. Annoying, playful, nothing more. But the more he tried to brush it off, the more it gnawed at him. And today, Jack finally pushed too far. It started harmlessly enough. They were in the library, working on a group project with a few classmates. Jack, of course, had ended up next to Eric. And as usual, he couldn't sit still. Eric was trying to read when Jack leaned over and whispered, "Hey!" Eric didn't look up. "What?" Jack nudged him lightly. "You ever think about me when I'm not around?" Eric's grip on his pen tightened. "No," Jack chuckled. "Liar." Eric huffed, refusing to take the bait. But Jack didn't stop there. He reached out and gently tugged at a strand of Eric's hair. "I bet you do," he murmured, quieter this time. "Bet you wonder what I'm thinking when I look at you." Something in Eric snapped. He turned, eyes blazing. "What is your problem, Jack?" The laughter in Jack's face flickered, just for a second. "Problem?" "You act like everything's a joke," Eric said, voice lower now, but no less tense. "You mess with me all the time, and I don't even know why." Jack's smirk didn't drop, but there was something forced about it now. "Maybe I just like seeing you worked up." Eric's chest tightened. He wasn't sure what he wanted. An answer, an admission, anything that made sense. But Jack was still hiding behind that stupid, playful mask. Eric exhaled sharply, shoving his chair back. "Forget it." Jack reached for his wrist, but Eric pulled away before he could touch him. He ignored the way Jack's expression faltered and walked out of the library without looking back. His heart was racing, but this time it wasn't from embarrassment. It was something sharper, heavier. Why did Jack always have to push things just a little too far? And why, despite everything, did part of him wish Jack would just tell him the truth? Eric stormed out of the library, his emotions a tangled mess. Jack always did this, teased, flirted, acted like nothing was serious. And Eric was tired of it. As he stepped outside, he barely registered that it had started raining. The drizzle was light at first, cool against his skin, but his mind was too preoccupied to care. He took a deep breath, trying to cool the frustration burning in his chest. Then his foot slipped. The world tilted, and before he could catch himself, he was tumbling down the last few steps. Pain jolted through his body as he hit the ground, his knee scraping hard against the pavement. For a moment, he just sat there, stunned. Then the sting kicked in, sharp, burning. His uniform pants were torn at the knee, and blood was already seeping through the fabric. "Eric!" He barely had time to process the voice before Jack was crouching in front of him, eyes wide with something dangerously close to actual worry. "What the hell was that?" Jack demanded, scanning him like he was checking for broken bones. Eric scowled, more out of embarrassment than pain. "I fell, obviously." Jack ignored the sarcasm, his gaze locking onto the wound. His jaw clenched. "You're bleeding." "It's not that bad." Jack was already pulling off his hoodie. Before Eric could protest, Jack tore a strip from the bottom of his shirt and reached for his knee. "Jack, what are you? Hold still." Jack's voice wasn't teasing this time. It was quiet. Firm. He carefully wrapped the torn fabric around Eric's knee, tying it snugly to stop the bleeding. Eric sat frozen, watching as Jack's hands moved with unexpected gentleness. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by something unreadable. "You're so careless," Jack muttered, finishing the makeshift bandage. "What if you broke something?" Eric blinked. "Since when do you care?" Jack stilled, then let out a small scoff. "I always care, idiot." The words hit Eric harder than he expected. His chest tightened, and for once he couldn't think of a single comeback. Jack stood up and held out a hand. "Come on." Eric hesitated, but eventually placed his hand in Jack's. The warmth of his palm sent a strange shiver up his arm as Jack pulled him up with ease. For a moment, they just stood there, rain dripping around them. Jack still hadn't let go of his hand. Eric swallowed, heart pounding. Maybe Jack hadn't just been joking all this time. Maybe there was something real behind all of it. And that realization scared him more than the fall ever could. Chapter 5, The Truth Between Us. The rain had eased into a soft drizzle, but Eric barely noticed. His heart was still racing from Jack's words. "I always care, idiot." That shouldn't have meant anything. Jack said dumb things all the time. But this felt different. The way he had looked at him, the way his grip on Eric's hand lingered, there was no teasing behind it. Eric swallowed hard, trying to focus on anything except how warm Jack's hand felt in his. I can walk on my own, you know. Jack raised an eyebrow but let go, shoving his hands into his pockets. Yeah? You sure you're not going to trip again? Eric huffed. That was one time. Two, actually. Remember last week when you almost face-planted into a bookshelf? Eric opened his mouth to argue but quickly shut it. That had happened. But that wasn't the point right now. He took a step forward, testing his knee. It stung, but it wasn't unbearable. Jack watched him carefully. You okay? Eric nodded, though he couldn't shake the way Jack was still looking at him. He was used to the teasing, the smirks, the eye rolls. But this was something else entirely. Jack, Eric hesitated, glancing away. Why are you acting like this? Like what? Eric exhaled, rubbing his temples. Like you actually... He cut himself off before the words slipped out. Jack tilted his head. Like I actually what? Eric hesitated. Like you actually care. But Jack had always acted like he didn't. He was always pushing, always teasing. It had never felt real. Had it? Eric's pulse quickened as his mind replayed the moments between them. The way Jack had always been close, the way he'd always noticed things about Eric, the way he never actually crossed the line into real cruelty. And then today, the way he had immediately rushed to help him, the worry in his voice, the softness in his touch. Had he been misunderstanding everything? Jack sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Look, Eric, you probably think I'm an ass, and maybe I am, but I don't mess with people just for fun. He shifted his weight, avoiding Eric's gaze. I mess with you because you're the only one I want to pay attention to me. Eric's breath caught. Jack let out a dry chuckle. I know. Stupid way to show it, right? I didn't know how else to... He groaned, running a hand through his damp hair. Screw it, I like you, okay? I have for a long time. Eric's heart stopped. Jack liked him? Eric stared, his mind scrambling to process everything. All this time, Jack exhaled sharply and took a step back. Look, forget it. I know I probably ruined everything by... Jack. Jack froze. Eric didn't know what came over him, but before he could think it through, he grabbed the front of Jack's damp shirt and pulled him closer. Their faces were barely inches apart now, and for the first time, Jack wasn't smirking. He looked completely caught off guard. Shut up, Eric murmured, heart pounding. Jack blinked. What? Eric kissed him. It was quick, hesitant, but real. And the moment it happened, Eric felt everything click into place. This was what had been lingering between them all along. This unspoken, unresolved tension that had nothing to do with irritation and everything to do with something deeper. Jack stood completely still for half a second. Then, as if something in him snapped, he grabbed Eric's waist and pulled him in, kissing him back with far more confidence. His lips were warm, despite the rain, firm but careful, like he had been waiting for this for way too long. When they finally pulled apart, Eric was breathless. Jack was staring at him, eyes slightly wide, like he couldn't believe this was real. That just happened, Jack muttered. Eric swallowed, nodding. Yeah. A slow grin crept onto Jack's face. So, does this mean I don't have to flirt by annoying you anymore? Eric groaned, shoving at his chest. Oh my God, shut up! Jack just laughed, but this time there was no teasing edge, just something warm. Something real. And this time, when Jack reached for his hand again, Eric didn't pull away.